Today we'll be talking about the history of marijuana at the border, the history of Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, and the racial events that ensued. Hi, my name's Hawker.
My name's Adam.
And I'm Brennan.
Mexico was the leading producer of marijuana, cocaine, morphine, and opium in the early 20th century. Little is known about how and why Mexico became involved in illegally smuggling drugs. In the early 1900s, these drugs were legal to purchase without any issue. However, people were starting to turn to these drugs for personal use when they were supposed to be used for medications. This would cause the United States to be the largest importer and user of these drugs. So the United States started to work on implementing strict laws on the consumption and commercialization of drugs in the states. One of these laws that would be the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which Adam will discuss.
In 1937, the United States issued the Marijuana Tax Act. This stopped the recreational use of marijuana. It placed a tax on the sale of marijuana, making it a lot less economical to grow or use. There are many different things that led up to the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. In 1930, the Bureau of Narcotics was established. Harry J. Anslinger was appointed to be the commissioner of the Bureau. Anslinger was very tough on marijuana. One tactic that Anslinger and the Bureau used to persuade citizens was the publication of anti-marijuana propaganda. Some of these propaganda articles included Marijuana the Killer, Tea for a Viper, Sex Crazy Menaces, and Public Enemy Number One. Many of these articles had no scientific evidence and were often fake accounts. According to Michael Schallner's article, The Federal Prohibition of Marijuana, the government and the Bureau offered several biased studies. One study tested the effects of marijuana on dogs. From the study, they concluded that marijuana was degenerative to the human brain. Another government botanist detailed how marijuana grows, but said nothing about being a drug. With no scientific evidence, the government decided that marijuana was a narcotic and a dangerous drug. They saw it as a drug that makes people crazy and cause crimes. The Tax Act of 1937 also came into existence due to some racial ideologies following the immigration of different races in America. Here's Brennan to elaborate more on the Mexican hypothesis.
The theory of the Mexican hypothesis comes from many different books and articles. I will be pulling all of my information from literature called Mexicans and the Origins of Marijuana Prohibition in the United States, a reassessment, which was written by Isaac Campos. Between 1963 and 1984, scholars in several fields established what came to be known as the Mexican hypothesis involving marijuana prohibition in the United States. You may ask, how does this affect the immigration into the U.S.? Well, after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, Mexican immigrants flooded into the U.S. This was the beginning of Mexican Americans in the United States. This was a shock to many in the country that so many Mexicans were crossing the border, and some of those in power attempted to rid the Mexican immigrants in ways that I will cover in a moment. Many of the Mexicans that came to the U.S. following the revolution only casually smoked marijuana. An image of a relationship between Mexicans and marijuana was created by those in power of the country with the intent to tarnish the Mexican people and the reputation of the drug. The Mexican hypothesis proposes the idea that the history of drug prohibitions is a product of racism, also understood as tools wielded to oppress labor in the U.S. The Mexicans were linked to marijuana, opium was linked to the Chinese, and cocaine was linked to the African Americans. Although the Mexican hypothesis has the possibility of being true, it lacks much data and needs more research to be proven true. One could say that the Mexican hypothesis stands on unstable ground. In fact, recent research shows that the history in Mexico runs counter to the notion that the drug was used widely and casually by Mexican migrants, meaning that the linkage between Mexicans and marijuana was actually weak. Referring back to stereotypes, it was said that the Mexican marijuana user had tendencies that could be described as ferocious and unpredictable, kind of like a dangerous madman. Obviously, this was not a good image of the Mexican people. Isaac Campos argues that the role of Mexican immigrants in the history of the U.S. marijuana prohibition has surely been overstated, and that much research remains to be done on this subject of the Mexican hypothesis. The Mexican hypothesis shows why our border is the way that it is today because it gives an image of what the origin of the war on drugs in the U.S. looked like. It does not just relate to Mexican people either, but also to many different races and ethnicities, as I mentioned earlier, in relation to the Chinese and African American communities. The violence and crime that is at our borders today could be a result of early racism in our country, according to Isaac Campos' reassessment of the Mexican hypothesis. It is safe for us to conclude that the present-day relationship in the United States has with drugs on our borders is deeply rooted in our country's past tensions with races and ethnicities that are not white. The war on drugs in our country could have been easily avoided, or at least a fraction of what it is today, if racist ideology had been eliminated from society at the source. Our call to action is for the American people to educate themselves on the origin of the war on drugs and to realize the racist ideology of the early country. We appreciate you listening to our podcast on the topic of drugs at the borders. This has been Brennan,
Hawker.
Adam.
signing off, and we will see you next time.